Okay, folks, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. We are here today. My name is Elizabeth Pellerito. I'm the director of the Labor Education Program here at UMass Lowell. And on behalf of myself and Dr. Pam Whitefield, who is also a member of the Labor Education Program, we are here to welcome our speaker today, Jamie McCallum. Dr. McCallum is an author, teacher, and activist focusing on labor and work issues globally. He is an associate professor of sociology at Middlebury College in Vermont, where he researches and teaches courses on the sociology of labor, political sociology, social theory, globalization, organizing for social change, and sexuality. His work has won scholarly awards and appeared in the Washington Post, Mother Jones, Jacobin, Dissent, In These Times, and other magazines, as well as scholarly publications. In addition, Dr. McCallum has directed several short films, sits on the executive board of the Rights and Democracy Institute, is a volunteer firefighter in Weybridge, Vermont, and is the newest member of the school board in Weybridge as well. So Dr. McCallum's most recent book, which we read pieces of in the Intro to Labor Studies course, is called Worked Over: How Round-the-Clock Work is Killing the American Dream. Published in 2020, it demonstrates the ways in which, from Amazon warehouses to Rust Belt factories to California's gig economy, it's the hours of low-wage workers that have increased the most, but also are the most volatile and precarious. And Dr. McCallum traces the varied reasons why our lives became tethered to unstable jobs in the first place, and describes how we might gain a greater say over our work time and build a more just society. Dr. McCallum's 2013 book, called Global Unions, Local Power: The New Spirit of Transnational Labor Organizing, won the Best Book Award from the Labor section of the American Sociological Association. And this important book examines the ability of workers to exercise power across national borders and challenge corporate governance, and draws on research conducted with over 100 workers, unionists, and business leaders in 9 countries. And finally, we know that the pandemic has deeply impacted work and working conditions across the board, and so it's more important now than ever to think about how we structure work, what it means, and how we can create change that is more equitable to workers. And we're looking forward to Dr. McCallum's third book, due out this year, called Essential: How the Pandemic Transformed the Long Struggle for Worker Justice, stemming from interviews with essential workers, quote unquote essential workers, and research on public health. The book argues that bad jobs for essential workers hurt everyone, and that we all have a stake in making sure workers have the justice they deserve. And I believe we're going to hear more about that project today. So we want to very much thank Dr. McCallum for making the trip to Lowell. We want to also thank the co-sponsors along with the Labor Studies program of this event. So the Economics Department, the History Department, the American Studies program, and the Sociology Department. And we appreciate the College of Fine Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for joining us as well today. And we will have time for Q&A after the talk. So we will take questions as they come up. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. McCallum.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to Pam Whitefield and Elizabeth Pellerito for this invitation. I'm very excited. I was on parental leave and now sabbatical. I've not been in front of a classroom in 2 years. I know I've been doing all the sort of online lecturing circuit, but I'm very happy to be here with you all today. So I'll just as Elizabeth said, I wrote this book during the pandemic that was about labor time, and that book led me to begin almost immediately when it came out, start rethinking what the implications of it were for the pandemic. So today I'm mostly going to focus on that new project. Although I know you've read some of the Worked Over, I'm happy to talk about it in the middle or in the Q&A whenever that comes up. So thanks again for being here today, and also for the co-sponsors that helped make this possible. I really, really appreciate it. So I'd like to start, so these are these two books. I'd like to start just by telling an anecdote. I interviewed, close to 100 healthcare workers, teachers, slaughterhouse workers, grocery clerks, anyone that would talk to me, essentially, who worked in an essential industry in 2020 and 2021. And Kim Mennick, for me, stood out. Kim was a traveling nurse who lives in North Carolina but travels all around the country doing her work. She was in Brooklyn in April of 2020, really in the heart of New York City's pandemic. She reminded me when she was walking to work that day, it was that weird, are any of you from New York City? No, that weird area of New York when like the sort of brownstones block out the sun, cherry blossoms are coming out. It's amazing, and everyone was banging on pots and pans in support of healthcare workers. Every night at 7 p.m. It happened across the world. New Yorkers did the same thing. In Wuhan, in China, they chanted Jiao, which literally means add oil, which is sort of a call of fortitude and encouragement to essential workers. When the pandemic moved to Lombardy, Italy, they sang Bella Ciao, sort of classic old partisan radical folk song, the lyrics of which say, "The day shall come when we all shall work in freedom." So when the virus hit New York, New Yorkers did the same thing. So Kim was walking to work. She walked in the ER, and there was a woman essentially screaming at people to save her life. She was clutching a little photo of her 6-year-old child. She was 26 years old herself, and they worked on her for hours, like code after code. She kept, coming back, disappearing, coming back, disappearing a little bit, like sort of her vital signs. And eventually they lost her. And Kim and the nurses sort of encouraged people to gather around her bed, bowed their heads to sort of a moment of silence amidst all the chaos, and went right back to work. Kim told me, she said, back then, we saved the ones we could and tried to stay alive ourselves. Staying alive was harder than it sounds. COVID-19 is an occupational disease, and as soon as outbreaks began ravaging U.S. cities, workers began fighting for better working conditions. And so to do their jobs well, they recognized the need to fight for better standards. So as I said, Kim was a traveler and routinely received calls to replace striking workers all around the country at jobs that paid 4 and 5 times what a normal nurse would get paid. And she never took them. That's the way we improve healthcare, she said. That's the way we stay alive. You live fighting or die working. So between sort of the Scylla of the virus and the Charybdis of the economic crisis, essential workers face this dilemma of unprecedented complexity, one magnified by their ambiguous status as both heroes on the one hand and victims on the other. Either sort of risk their lives at work or stay home and risk their livelihoods. And so my research was sort of about the workers who face this impossible dilemma and what it means, especially for the rest of us. So the pandemic illustrated, as Elizabeth said in her introduction, why we should all care about workers' rights, even in good times, and even if we ourselves don't hold bad jobs. So pitifully low pay ensured that nursing home workers had to work multiple jobs, and they carried the virus with them as they moved from home to home, infecting the patients that they were there to save. When growers and harvesters worked in unsanitary conditions, our food is dirty. If teachers don't have what they need to be successful, our kids and students won't have it either. When delivery and logistics workers log too many hours or spend sort of all day and night behind the wheel, deadly accidents are more common. And if caregivers don't have health care themselves or work for poverty wages or have too many patients or not enough PPE, our level of care will be substandard. And if their protests and other attempts to improve their working conditions are opposed or ignored, as they were during the pandemic, we will make no progress. So in short, the pandemic, I think, revealed the extent to which our lives are intertwined with the jobs of essential workers. They jeopardize their health and safety for the greater good, and not always willingly. Yet the pernicious conditions they worked under and obstacles they faced to improving their jobs undermine not only their personal health, but our collective well-being. So by shortchanging essential workers, we sort of performed a collective Ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake devouring its own tail. Conversely, when their jobs are better, we all benefit. Higher wages, safer staffing ratios, and unions have been positively correlated with better health outcomes for patients in hospitals. Unionized workers across essential industries had more access to paid sick leave, more PPE, and were tested for COVID-19 more regularly. These factors reduced infections and the spread of the disease. Thanks to unions in the airline industry today, we fly on planes without sucking in secondhand smoke or with the peace of mind that passengers can't carry on tiny knives because those unions fought for those safety changes. Labor unions don't just make better jobs for their members. They've been shown to increase the wealth for all workers, decrease the wage gap for families of color, reduce racial resentment among whites. Unionized workers in impacted industries kept their jobs also at higher rates during the pandemic recession, maintaining that important connection to the labor market. When union nurses in New York City's hospitals lobbied Governor Cuomo, or then Governor Cuomo, for their members to get a new N95 every day, the governor was forced to give one to every nurse, union or not. And in nursing homes, where workers had unions, residents died of COVID-19 at far lower rates, and workers were infected at far lower rates. Their working conditions, in other words, are our living conditions. Essential workers seem to understand this better than anyone. From the moment the pandemic began, many framed their grievances as beneficial to society at large. The relationship between bad jobs and public welfare was undeniable. Yet this link has long been recognized by labor activists. In the early 20th century, the industrial workers of the world adopted a slogan: an injury to one is an injury to all. Armed with this ideological and strategic North Star, they organized workers into one big union. So, sort of regardless of race or occupation or religion, stuff like that. So exceptional as it was, the pandemic actually reflected this long-standing view of the labor movement, especially its radical flank. And as this research shows, the pandemic also demanded that workers experiment with new kinds of protest actions that weren't always sort of historically informed, and form unique political alliances and sort of push the boundaries of what a union can do. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of that activism now. Not now. In a minute. Hold on. Sorry. So these maps here are basically using Google mobility data. So they show overall 66% reduction from February to April in New York City of movement. So essentially, the April map is just essential workers traveling around the city. The extent to which people reduced their movement was essentially dictated by occupation and social class. Those at the bottom of the income ladder essentially had almost no ability to telecommute. The high dispersion factor of the virus, what epidemiologists call the K number, early on indicated that workplace transmission was driving the pandemic. A study of a large retail store in Boston found that employees with customer-facing jobs were about 5 times more likely to have coronavirus antibodies than workers in other roles, even in the same workplace. Additional studies have attributed high rates of infections to workplace exposures in agriculture and construction. And in a survey of service workers, 41% responded that they were not able to consistently maintain physical distance from others on the job, even a year into the pandemic. So workplace exposure also offers a compelling explanation for racial disparity that characterized the pandemic. In California, for example, Latinos had excess mortality of 36%, but that number jumped to almost double if they'd worked in the fields, harvesting and growing food during the pandemic, where social distancing rules were essentially not followed. Black, Latino, and indigenous people are not only more likely to die of coronavirus than white people, but were more likely to be exposed and infected through work in the first place. Black Americans are overrepresented in jobs that put workers in close contact with others. They are 30% of bus drivers, nearly 20% of food service workers, janitors, cashiers, and stockers, despite being, of course, only 12% of the national population. We found that in meatpacking, almost half of the workers are Latino and a quarter are Black. 8% of all COVID-19 infections and 4% of all COVID deaths may have originated in meatpacking plants. So it was all these factors that really gave rise to some of the early unrest in the pandemic. And I want to talk about this in two waves. Sort of the first wave, which was really April 2020 to early fall, and then sort of a break, and then sort of a second wave of strikes. And I'll talk about this in terms of three things: mutual aid, self-defense, and social justice. So basically, so early in the pandemic, and I'm trying to move quickly through some of this because I'm going to come back to it. So early in the pandemic, if you looked in China, Italy, some parts of Europe that had it just after Italy, and then New York and California, places all around the world were organizing essentially mutual aid societies. In fact, I know one was formed right here in Lowell. I helped form one in my little corner of Vermont. And so basically ways where communities came together to share resources, you went shopping for your elderly neighbors, et cetera. Well, workers formed the same kinds of things in workplaces. So I interviewed delivery drivers in Wuhan who, after they got done their shift delivering stuff for paid work, they went out to the sort of areas around the city that were outside the barricades to deliver important essential services, or important essential materials that you couldn't always get. They shepherded workers to and from hospitals and schools, all this sort of extra work. So to me, that unrest was, that kind of organizing, I think, was indicative of ways that workers sort of looked beyond the workplace and sort of acted socially. There were other, you have a question? Is there a question? No. If you have a question, you feel free to just interrupt, that's fine. Workers formed sort of what they called self-defense groups in hospitals or flying squads, where they went around after, in New York City especially, went around after work dealing with non-COVID pathologies that happened in the community when people couldn't come to hospitals. And so this third thing I want to focus on a little bit more were social justice strikes. And this was important essentially because it really overlapped significantly with the movement for Black Lives and the strike for Black Lives. So in the fall of 2021, and so all this was happening early in the pandemic. There were about a third of that activism early in the pandemic was led by workers without a union, which is, for any of you who know this data, incredibly high. Like, it's very rare for workers to just go rogue, actually, especially in such large numbers. And so that sort of activism that was relatively spontaneous characterized some of the early pandemic. The second wave was a little bit different, and I want to talk a little bit about that more now. So in the fall of 2021, workers more went on the offense and were less concerned in some ways with some of the worker safety issues that characterized the early pandemic. 10,000 workers walked off the job at John Deere. They joined thousands of workers on strike at Warrior Met, the coal mine in Alabama, about 1,000 workers at St. Vincent's in Worcester. Food workers at Frito-Lay, Nabisco, Kellogg's were on strike over bad conditions, long hours, and low pay. There were graduate student workers on strike at Harvard, as well as symphony musicians in San Antonio and whiskey makers in Kentucky, shutting down orchestras and bourbon production. Taxi drivers in New York City were on the second week of an indefinite hunger strike, and 60,000 camera crew workers in Hollywood had authorized a strike, as well as almost 40,000 healthcare workers at Kaiser. And all of a sudden, people were like, "Oh my God, what is going on?" So remember, this was exactly the same time of the sort of persistent labor shortage. It meant that workers enjoyed sort of a moment of greater leverage over employers who were short-staffed. So with workers harder to replace, they seemed to be taking advantage of a crisis for the bosses. The Great Resignation, or in other words, as it came to be called, sort of characterized the Great Discontent. So as a group of strikes, they accomplished something sort of with individual significance. People won in both ways. People won more PPE, more money, more sick leave, more better testing at work, always better childcare at work, all these kinds of things. As a group, I think it was different. They sort of deepened the crisis for capital that had already been set in motion by the labor shortage. Workers can only win when they create a crisis for employers and the state. Strikes, and especially large ones, and especially alongside others, force businesses to make hard choices. The labor shortage provided just such a context, and unions, to some extent, really did step through the window of opportunity. The labor shortage, of course, was really a surplus of bad jobs, and the strikes in some ways were a direct response. So an employer's reluctance to raise wages shows in some ways they've sort of become almost reliant or addicted to sort of a low-wage labor force. And of course, one point of Striketober, which came, the fall strikes came to be characterized as Striketober, was to break them of that habit. So the two major places where some of the sort of resistance and the labor shortage overlapped, but I think which received less attention was in healthcare and education. And I'll talk about that a little bit more now, especially in nursing homes and schools. So by 2021, more than 40% of all reported coronavirus diseases and deaths in the US had occurred in nursing homes. About 200,000 residents and staff of nursing homes and long-term care facilities had died of COVID. That's 1 in 10 residents dead of the disease. Together, resident and staff illnesses accounted for 6% of all cases and about 40% of deaths nationwide. In 2020, working in an American nursing home was about the most dangerous job in the world. Larger nursing homes with more beds and higher occupancy rates were more likely to have COVID cases and deaths, as are homes where people of color comprise a larger share of the resident population. High rates of COVID and death within nursing homes are associated with high level of community transmission of the virus, and this is because nursing home workers, as I said earlier, literally move from job to job carrying the virus with them. And I interviewed countless people who, when I got to the time to ask them the question, do you think you gave people COVID? And every one of them said yes, and half of them broke down. Like just, the pressure and the knowledge of that fact was, it's just so much to deal with. So I worked on a research team with political scientists named Adam Dean and 2 other medical doctors. And we did research together on this, on health and safety and unions during the pandemic. So we did a study on all 15,000 nursing homes in the continental US. We found that unions were associated with a 10% lower resident mortality rate and an 8% lower worker infection rate. These 2 phenomena are related because union workers have better access to PPE than their non-union counterparts, which significantly reduced the transmission of the virus among residents. So I interviewed a woman named Roz from Chicago who was on strike for a couple weeks against her nursing home, and she said, it's pretty simple. The safer we are, the safer they are, meaning the residents. With more than 75,000 COVID-19 deaths among residents in non-unionized homes during the period of our study, these results suggest that industry-wide unionization, in other words, if everyone in a nursing home had a union, would be associated with approximately 7,000 fewer resident deaths. So again, better jobs for essential workers means better outcomes and lives for the rest of us. This union effect, quote unquote, disproportionately affects women of color because they're overrepresented in that labor pool. Black workers are more likely to work in frontline occupations or perform tasks that involve higher risks. So for example, in nursing homes, CNAs, direct care workers are far more likely to be black than are charge nurses, schedule makers, et cetera, where you could close a door to your office. And that made all the difference for a couple years. It still does, actually. So those stark racial divides are very present. The other place it happened was, which our research touched on, was in schools. So I'll talk a little bit about this now. So the CDC, obviously, for a long time advised mask wearing in schools. I understand now that you guys have changed. Where I live in Vermont, schools are almost going maskless as well. But when we were doing our research, it was still, mask time. So we focused on Iowa, where only 60% of school districts had mask mandates. Why? What made the difference? Why did some schools have them, other schools did not? So in the absence of robust federal standards, teachers' unions played an essential role in securing safe classrooms for communities. So for example, our research found that districts with stronger teachers' unions were more likely to adopt mask mandates. Independent of the extent of community spread, what really mattered was whether a teachers' union was able to actually fight and win for robust safety protections like masks. So this graph shows some of that. What this shows essentially is that as unions are stronger, or really as the union density rate increases, so does the likelihood that that union or school district will adopt a mask mandate. Mask mandates protect more than teachers and students. Schools that required masks in 2020 saw an incredible 37% drop in COVID cases. And research shows that masks slow community spread. So in other words, strong unions were an important mechanism by which teachers helped slow the spread of the virus in workplaces and beyond. Where are we on time here? How are we doing? Okay? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit more about healthcare. Given that unions and better working conditions are intertwined, you would think we'd be producing more of those jobs, but we're not. So over the last decade, as the graph shows, healthcare jobs have risen steadily, growing at a faster rate than all other jobs after 2000. This sector generated 56% of growth in low-wage jobs in the 80s, 63% in the 90s, 74% in the 2000s. Much of this low-wage growth can be attributed to the shocking rise in home health services, the fastest growing job in America. This raw data is essentially the empirical foundation for any discussion of the care economy. So in my field, we talk a lot about the future of work. And what people often talk about when they think this is, robot factories and Elon Musk doing tunnels and that kind of stuff, whatever else it is. And in some ways, if you just look up the stats, what you should do when you think of the future of work, you should picture a woman of color in scrubs. And that is the future sort of the American workplace. And you should picture her without health care. And picture her without adequate access to paid sick leave, which makes her job even harder. And so that future is what we're facing, and the pandemic, though it clearly exacerbated the problem, has almost done nothing to change the reality. And I'll get to maybe some of that stuff toward the end. So as the graph shows, the pandemic momentarily paused this large-scale transition. That's that little V at the top of the line. The exception to this, where is the exception, is in nursing and residential care facilities. So debates about the sort of pandemic-induced labor shortage mostly ignored nurses, who've actually been in short supply for decades. The way this works is that hospitals essentially intentionally understaff nurses to maximize profits. Labor costs account for about half of the hospital's budget. They make money by cutting life-saving medical professionals. The result is an epidemic of long hours, overwork, abuse, low pay, and record-high nurse-to-patient staffing ratios. This problem obviously affects all of us because it means we go to the hospital, our nurse is overworked and busier than we want them to be. Moreover, there's not actually a nursing shortage. We have 4 million licensed nurses in America, which is about 1/7 of all nurses in the entire world. The problem is that nursing jobs are horrible, and nurses have been quitting them at exceptional rates. The dangerous and stressful conditions they are expected to work under have been driving them from the bedside for years. And these horrible conditions for them are combined with a decline in life-saving care and capacity in hospitals. So decades of profit-driven cutbacks before the pandemic meant that in 2020, when we needed care more than ever, it was often unavailable. From 2008 to 2016, per capita public spending fell by about 10%. Data from the CDC and AHA show we have over 500,000 fewer hospital beds than we did in 1975, despite a larger and overall older population. We have fewer nonprofit hospitals and 60% more private hospitals than we did then. In the wake of the Great Recession in 2007, 8, 9, the explosive growth of for-profit healthcare increased the census of hospitals, in other words, the people in them, delivering more bang for the investor's buck. And even though the employment in healthcare steadily rose, public funding for it was reduced in most states. The result is that we are left without adequate surge capacity in April, March, whatever you want to say, in 2020. So when the pandemic hit, U.S. had fewer than 3 hospital beds per 1,000 people, the same number as did Turkey. By contrast, Japan and South Korea had 13 and 12 respectively, an advantage that helped them dramatically weather the storm with exceptionally fewer deaths. This reduction in healthcare capacity and bad jobs for workers, which matched by a decrease in life-saving equipment, which also impacted people like Kim, who I mentioned at the beginning. So in May of 2020, about 87% of nurses reported having to reuse a single disposable mask or an N95 respirator. And almost 1/3 said they've been exposed to COVID-19 patients without wearing a single speck of PPE. Unavailable PPE meant that healthcare personnel were more likely to become ill, requiring care, and reducing their capacity to work, which raised the sort of the busyness and decreased the job quality of other workers who were working. We know what happened next. Doctors were forced to ration life-saving materials among those who they thought had the best chance of survival. My own aunt, actually, Barbara Kisselbach, died in a Pennsylvania hospital of COVID because there was not enough oxygen to go around when they were rationing it. So to me, this problem of workers, care, whatever else you lump on there, exposes what we might call a crisis of social reproduction. So let me go through what that means a little bit for some of you who may not have be familiar with the term. Social reproduction describes the process necessary to regenerate the workforce. There is a narrow view of the concept that looks specifically at the role of sort of unpaid, usually female-dominated, home-based work. Social reproduction is typically sort of hidden from plain sight, or it lies, as the philosopher Nancy Fraser says, in the hidden abode of capitalist production. Fraser draws on Marx, who fretted a good deal of his own life in the hidden abode of the British Museum, sort of writing about sort of the problem of exploitation. Fraser draws and says, Fraser's view is important because it draws attention to this workforce, which is basically never considered to be a workforce, and argues that it's very important for the sort of main capitalist economy to continue going. There's a broader view of the concept, but I think the pandemic, it forces us to sort of embrace. And sort of think about what counts when we think of social reproduction. So in other words, when you care for your own children, there's no impact on GDP. But if you hire someone to care for your children to do the exact same work, GDP goes up. Social reproduction allows us to see the work as crucial in both circumstances. And that, to me, is why the concept is so significant. So there's a defining contradiction in modern capitalist life. On the one hand, social reproduction is a necessary condition for the stability of the economic system. Making sure that workers are regularly housed, clothed, rested, and fed, and their children are cared for is essential before you can go to work, even if you work from home. As Fraser argues, at the same time, the drive to unlimited profits and accumulated wealth tends to sort of destabilize the process on which social reproduction rests. So it drives wages down and hours up. Housing costs go up as housing costs and prices rise as the minimum wage stagnates. And eventually, something has to give. So the pandemic profoundly disrupted our ability to work for a wage while performing the same amount of domestic home-based labor. During the pandemic then, in some ways, wage workers became our caregivers more than ever. Social media was aflutter with posts describing the deep emotional connections that citizens had with essentially non-essential workers with essential workers. So in other words, we always had this outpouring of support for grocery clerks and gas station attendants and caregivers and delivery drivers that were basically invisible just months before. This increased reliance deepens the distinction between waged and unwaged care work in stark ways. We weren't banging on pots and pans for unemployed family members taking care of each other. We were saluting employees taking care of all of us. By dragging the domestic sphere into the sunlight, the pandemic rendered it less of a hidden abode and more of a public battleground. And this blur was brought into sharp relief when essential workers staged walkouts, protests, slowdowns, sickouts, or strikes. Far from abandoning their duties, caring for the rest of us, these disruptions served to increase their capacity to do that kind of vital work. So when nurses in California, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Florida, when they went on strike, they came back from the picket line or the bargaining table with better staffing ratios, with more paid sick leave, with more money so they could take a break, right? That benefits all of us. When Chicago and Philadelphia and Los Angeles teachers refused to teach in-person classes until there were widespread vaccinations for them, their students, and their families, They pressured local authorities to prioritize a very strategic sector of the population that was a hotbed of sort of spreading COVID. So when workers disrupted their work routines, they also made it clear that the work they're paid to do is only a portion of their social value. Nursing home workers don't simply change bedpans and feed the elderly. They sing them to sleep. They hold their hands when they die, and they patiently tell their families when they don't make it. Doctors don't just keep people alive, they make tough calls about who deserves a ventilator. That subjective decision-making is sort of an underappreciated role that they play. Nurses don't simply act at the bedside, but at the bargaining table. Grocery store clerks don't just stock shelves. They help keep order during sort of a panic buying pandemonium. So the pandemic spotlighted the multidimensional nature of essential workers' labor and helped us understand the importance and, by the extension, the power of those workers. So any system, I think, that ignores or degrades our ability to perform socially reproductive tasks is doomed. The good news and the bad news, actually, the good news and the bad news is that capitalism actually is just such a system. And the primary lesson from this crisis is that the best way to protect ourselves from biological threats is to reorganize our society so that common people, and especially workers, have more power and resources. Right-wing pundits sometimes call this socialism. And for once, they might be right. A major consequence of labor unrest during the pandemic was that, against great odds, essential workers helped to transform the political conversation about work in America. They even, to some extent, influenced the Democratic Party's established preference for austerity in ways that were essentially unimaginable before the pandemic. So Joe Biden essentially made his entire career on not being Bernie Sanders. And then, on the eve of his presidential election, he said, I'm going to be, quote, the most pro-union president you've ever seen. It's a low bar in America, actually, but he came kind of close. Why did he come out in support of Amazon workers, which was the most hotly debated union election in recent history? Or why did he immediately create a task force on worker organizing and empowerment, or pursue the Right to Organize Act, groundbreaking legislation that would have recast American labor law? He didn't have a change of heart. But he was reading the room and sort of reading the pulse. And at the time, milquetoast socialism was the order of the day. So long-held popular assumptions about the goodness of unfettered capitalism were being challenged in the press and in the workplace. The nature of this pandemic raised concerns about essential workers to issues of national security, which gave their struggles a larger audience and a deeper significance. So yet a year after campaigning to get things done, Biden has not been able to rally even members of his own party to his signature plans for jobs, infrastructure, climate, higher ed, and voting rights. Nonetheless, many of the country's major labor leaders seem to be waiting for him to do exactly that, when what was needed was decisive political leadership and militant grassroots organizing on a large scale. Basically, neither transpired. Over the last 5 decades, we performed the science of just-in-time capitalism, the sort of on-demand supply chains and logistics hubs that make the world economy run. The necessity of such a web today required that during the pandemic, the inputs of a particular commodity were required to stay open as long as possible, which helped disperse the virus. Super coordinated, high-tech systems of production, transportation, and the distribution of goods and services were almost overnight transformed into disease transmissions, arteries of disease transmission. Global capitalism literally made us sick. Capitalist employment treats workers with a reckless indifference, an indifference to their preventable deaths and conditions of work, and a recklessness rooted in the mistaken belief that our future, all of ours, is not contingent on their well-being. If the pandemic has showed us anything, it's that we need an alternative. To get there, workers will need to create a crisis for capital. The insurgent workers' movements of the 30s offer a glimpse into what this could look like. Then, large and unruly strikes swept through the country's basic industries, challenging the authority of our most powerful capitalists. Strikes shut down production in automobiles, mills, coal mines, transportation hubs, forcing employers to negotiate, and eventually for Roosevelt to intervene. Today, American liberals look back in awe at what the New Deal accomplished, but they forget very often that it was a compromise with the left flank, and especially the left flank of the labor movement. Today, we can't wait for labor can't wait for legislation to ease its woes. The unrest during the pandemic was inspiring, but fell far short of what is needed for real change. We need the union difference to exist in every industry as it did in nursing homes and schools. It's tempting to view the pandemic today as a sequel to previous crises. The coronavirus recession reminded us of 1929, the social unrest of 1968, and the virus itself of 1981, the AIDS epidemic. Instead, the pandemic is more likely to be a prequel to whatever climate change and capitalist globalization brings us next. The risk, then, is not that we repeat the mistakes of the past, but that we transmit our vulnerabilities into the future. So I hope this research sort of serves as an analysis of recent events, which can't be changed, and also sort of a polemic about what happens next, which of course is up to all of us. So thanks so much for listening, and I would love to take any questions you guys have. Thanks a lot. Okay, sure. Yeah.
So if you have a question, you can grab the mic, and then we'll take maybe 2 or 3 or 4, and then we'll let Jamie answer. Go ahead, Sam.
I have one question that's sort of 1 and 2. What do you think the role of the state is in all of this, and what do you think the role of the state ought to be in regards to this question?
Great question.
What is the question? What is the writers of what question?
What do we do about, it's the broad question.
Yeah, okay, great.
What now?
Right.
Let's take 1 or 2 more.
Do you have a book to read in the meantime while we're waiting for stuff to happen?
Yeah, okay, great. So I'll start with those 2?
Yeah, that works.
Okay, great, thank you. So, what's your name? Sam. Okay, thank you, Sam. So I cut short a little bit the what is to be done part, which of course is the end of every book that people like me write. It's it's slimmer than the rest of the book because we don't know actually. But so I think there's a few things. It would be there are very clear. American society right now is very supportive of things that the government could do to make it easier for workers to organize a union, for example. Right now, it's very, very next to impossible in some industries. And so some of this research suggests that unions are good, for example, for public health, or unions would raise wages across the industry, union or not. We need those things. And so the government could pass the PRO Act or some variation on the PRO Act, which would essentially almost overnight transform the ability of workers to do that kind of work, which would be amazing. Simply copying and pasting some other sort of rich capitalist countries' welfare state proposals, like more paid sick leave, vacation days, family leave, stuff like that. Like right now, we're alone in the world without guaranteeing some of those basic things among our peer nations. So doing those basic things would also be important, I suppose. Outside of some of those larger policy changes, the state, I think, and this is a big debate among people in the labor world, I guess, to what extent the state should sort of be the target of unions' activism or whether it should be more toward business. But there is a let me bring up one thing here, and this is where is my book? Well, I'll look for it when I'm talking in a minute. But so Americans' general concern, support for workers, and hatred of big business, that gap is bigger than it's ever been in the last half century. And so it suggests that public policy to prop up workers and actually to undermine some of the sort of the freedom of free enterprise actually is popular. And the Biden administration could capitalize upon that. Manchin and Sinema notwithstanding. So I think those are some things. Your question is obviously the broadest one, and at the end of the book, I go through some of those things. And the other one, so I'll say one more. The other one is healthcare. The failure to pass better, if not universal health care in America, is the single most important policy failure of the last, 75 years, especially after the pandemic. In my last book, you may have read some of this, so I argued that, for example, half Americans get their health care through work, which essentially puts your boss in charge of your well-being, which is, if any of you ever had a job, that's a bad situation, right? And so we need to basically eliminate that relationship and completely take health care out of the market and make it a free and accessible right to everyone. Doing that one thing alone would essentially reduce work hours, raise wages, increase the ability of workers to bargain for better things at the bargaining table, and save lives. So, that is one more, I suppose. I'm not suggesting that we're close to doing any of those things, but it's not because many of them are not popular among a lot of people. As for what's your name? Nick. As for your question, Nick, so you guys can help me out, actually. But the pandemic is not that old, and academic writing takes forever to produce and be published. So there's been some good stuff on workers in public health. That's more academic and journal article-y. Tell me, I don't. Yeah.
I'll say. There's a book that came out a few months ago, last year maybe, about kind of how people are organizing mutual aid initiatives. I can't remember the publisher. It's Pink, if that's helpful. But I think it's non-academic. There's some interesting ideas there. There's no overarching thesis. It's more like, people's testimonials of what kind of organizing they did and what some of the barriers they faced. But I think that if you're looking for a general audience read is useful. I'm sure that there's things. I don't know if you have any, Pam. Yeah.
So you were looking for a book to read in the meantime, I think. The only reason I got my book. Oh, well, that exists. Yeah. So that exists. And if you want, we can chat after, and I'm happy to pull you in the direction of some of those things. I don't want to go too hard on this, but the Americans, support for what they call socialism has dramatically increased, and with it, an argument about whether or not that actually is socialism or not, or blah blah blah. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that whatever they think it is an improvement essentially from what we have now. And so getting to read some of that stuff, involved in some of that stuff, I think is important. So I'm happy to point you to some stuff afterward. What else?
Hi. So you talked about you kind of talked about the pandemic as a prequel, and about this crisis as a prequel. And I'm kind of wondering, what do you see in the future in terms of with climate change? Do you think that this crisis in capitalism will deepen, or do you see recovery? What do you see in the future from this, I guess?
Do we have one more?
I've been really interested to see the fights going on over returning to schools in person or masking in schools, all of that. And the argument that I've found most convincing about why there's the kind of animosity that there is towards teachers who are demanding safer environments is because education is so highly unionized that fight is about disciplining labor as it's getting more sort of unruly in this moment. And I was wondering, this might be subjective, but I don't know if I've seen that same animosity towards healthcare workers, maybe in some instances. Have you, and do you think that there's a reason relating to their position in sort of capitalism that has to do with why that is.
Thank you. Yeah, these are great questions. So as the first, I mean, I don't know, obviously, actually, but if I did, I'd write that book. Actually, Bill Gates just wrote that book, sort of. It's like, how do we prevent the next pandemic? And none of the answers actually are about climate change, labor, politics. I don't. So I do think the reason I think it's a. So I'm sort of going off a little bit here, and this is stepping pretty far outside my area. But the people who know about this stuff think that it's a prequel. Right? They think that declining biodiversity and increasing urbanization, especially in the global south, is bound to drive our increased proximity between humans and wild animals, where deadly pathogens are lurking. I think in 2021, I think they identified 32 new novel coronaviruses, none of which, of course, there's a vaccine for. So, this year there will be more, and then next year there will be more. And so it seems to be the public health research suggests that this is a prequel. And I'm not versed well enough in that literature to know what they would say about preparation, but it does seem to be the case that places where very simple things, like places where people had greater ability to safeguard themselves and their neighbors and families from the virus through work, they were better off. Like there's the old left adage that we're all better off when we're all better off was never more true than the pandemic. Like I lived in Vermont. I live in Vermont. There was very little COVID there. There's very little people. There's nothing to do either. So it's not like you can go out and like get COVID somewhere. Like you got it in school or you got it in a nursing home or a hospital, and that's mostly where it happened. But obviously, Vermont is not the future. We have to figure out ways for people to really safeguard their communities collectively. And to me, those things are things that start with work. As for your question about the teachers, I think your answer is good. There is almost nothing more like politicized than schools these days. I mean, as Elizabeth said, I was just yesterday elected to my local school board, which I campaigned against my next door neighbor because this is Vermont and that's the way you do it. And we were basically fighting for certain things that basically about taxes, safety, and school closures. And this is just a brief tangent, but it's set fresh in my head because I was running and I'm who I am. My opponent's campaign was that schools aren't political. And therefore, we shouldn't be political. We should be neutral because children are neutral or something like that. And of course, schools are the most political thing in the planet, and school boards are a magnet for every lunatic in the country right now, advocating to overthrow the curriculum and whatever. So I think that you're right. Teachers endured greater hostility because kids are involved and because they're seen as having this position of inferring knowledge, which has sort of a subjective quality to it. Whereas healthcare workers are just sort of just out there saving lives and whatever. That's not really, that dichotomy is not true, but I think it does come through. The other thing you mentioned about unions, public sector unionization is what, 30-something%, right? About what it was nationally at its peak across all sectors. And most of that public sector unions are teachers. So if you could somehow destroy teachers' unions, well, then you would be significantly attacking the labor movement writ large. And so I think that is one of the reasons that those two industries, came under sort of different attack. Also, it's really difficult to attack nurses during the pandemic. Like even the most soulless, bloodless people, we're like, okay, nurses are performing an important function, all these things. And so that I think that public sentiment did increase the bargaining power of nurses in a way it didn't for teachers, who, by the way, did work remotely for a lot of the pandemic. That's what's pretty interesting. So we think of essential workers as being in person, but teachers, we ought to think of as part of it. When I interviewed a lot of workers, they would say, well, yeah, teachers are, of course, essential workers. But McDonald's people and Burger King people, oh, well, they're not, even though they're working in person. Like, it was a very subjective distinction. And I think, who was in and who was out was a large part of sort of deciding the sort of class, essential worker class or class formation of that group of people, which was pretty interesting. What else?
Quick follow-up. One place where we did see some of that attack on healthcare workers, I think, is the St. Vincent nurses strike in Worcester, which we haven't talked about yet in our class. We will. But this was like a bloody, vicious strike that drug on for months and months and months. And there was a lot of rhetoric about these nurses are selfish, they don't care, they're willing to go on strike during a pandemic. And what they were actually fighting for was patient essentially the number of patients per nurse. They wanted that number lowered because it allowed them to take better care of their patients. And, there's a lot of research out there about how patient safety rates, impact healthcare, and the narrative and the way that strike in particular was politicized. Now, that's not just about the pandemic. I think there's a bigger fight between privatized healthcare, privatized hospitals and public nonprofit hospitals that's also kind of being played out there, but I think that's the only one.
Yeah, so that strike, what you guys are going to talk about it, I suppose, was completely amazing. Marlena Pellegrino, this one nurse there, Marlena? I mean, she is, and I interviewed her. When I do my interviews now, I transcribe automatically, what do you call it, with one of those online transcribers, and her interview came out literally with a Boston accent. I guess a Worcester accent, so I couldn't read it when I was looking through the transcription. And they went on strike for what, 10 months during the middle of the pandemic. It's hard. I used to organize nurses for SEI, for the union, and there's nothing less popular than a nurse strike because you're literally stopping people from getting insulin and whatever. Sort of that's what the public thinks. During the pandemic, it was different. They enjoyed incredible public support. And they would come by and say, our jobs are better for, if nurses are outside, there's a problem inside. Our jobs are better for your families. And families were like, great, And so the support was really incredible. And to me, that does signal somewhat of a sea change for American workers because I don't think it's not so much sympathy as it is just selfishness. We really did realize that, my God, if these people can't take care of us, who's going to? And so I think that development was important. What else? Anything else? Yeah. Here you go.
You mentioned that this might be the start, and one area that I think that a lot of people are thinking about is that the stimulus checks during the pandemic kind of revealed how this required a different strategy that could have been used all along because big companies have been bailed out for as long as we can remember, but the money being given to the people has never been a strategy that's been used before, even though it goes directly into the economy. So I'm wondering if that's an avenue that might be pursued by people.
Anybody else? Sam, did you have another question?
I also have an anecdote that goes along with that. I was in the middle of Worcester to pick something up in the middle of that strike, and I saw 3 or 4 nurses outside of the hospital, and I walked by there because I actually had to use the bathroom. So I asked hey, can I go in? But what struck me most was there were for each nurse that was outside, there was 2 or 3 police officers standing a few feet away. It was bizarre because they were just standing there. They weren't even, they weren't doing much. And I guess my question is, you mentioned that we might want to look towards the labor movements of the past, of the 1930s, real militant labor action. But arguably that was sort of something that happened in a different social paradigm, Obviously a lot has changed since the 1930s, and, arguably the methods by which sort of power exerts itself have sort of fundamentally shifted. So how do you think our organizing strategies ought to change in regards to that shift away from how they were like 100 years ago or so?
And I want to say we have one of our esteemed labor history faculty members that might want to respond to that as well. Here, Bob. Yeah.
Okay. So, stimulus checks. I think the question is essentially, should giving people money be seen as a policy that we should sort of continue pursuing? And so there was a lot of debate early on, as people probably remember, as to whether or not stimulus checks constituted something like a basic income during the depths of the recession, or should it, or something. And I don't know, that's a pretty interesting question. Like, I have probably a different take. Like, I'm sort of less optimistic about the idea of a basic income than I think are other people, but because it's just so individual. But I think there are ways to sort of give people money that are just providing services for free, that actually is cheaper and more efficient and better. So what people call that, universal basic services, for example. That's not to say that in the current state we have, in the current situation we're living in, that the child tax credit and a more lucrative stimulus check and welfare payments in general should not be significantly increased, obviously, because they should. But I guess that's the way I would think about that debate to some extent. As far as the 30s, yes, I would love an esteemed historian to actually take that. But I'll just say one thing first, is that you said it's arguably different than it is today. I think you're right. It is arguably, like, it's sort of the same, though. There are some similarities. And one of those similarities, I do think, if you look at that, I'm sure one of you have shown this graph in your class where, like, unionization goes up and the percentage of income in the top 10 income earners goes down, and it looks like a U in a rainbow, upside down rainbow. And so it's like there is to some extent a social, political, economic parallel between the moment at which unionization took off in the 30s, right after the Great Depression, and now-ish. And I think that's worth considering. The other thing is that we often assume, I'm not saying you're doing this, but we often assume that the fruits of 20th century middle classness, or whatever you want to call it, was the result of the New Deal, the legacy of the New Deal, rather than the legacy of the New Deal being the result of militant organizing that was essentially a compromise with the left in any real way. At least that's, I guess, how I see it. Maybe that's my own lens. But I'd be curious. Are you the labor historian that people are talking about? I'd be curious to, not to put you on the spot, but to hear what you think.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm esteemed or not, but I am, by training, a labor historian. And I actually think you're right. I was actually teaching this today, and I think I'm coming to the conclusion that there's more parallels between now and the late 20s, early 30s than we think there were, in the sense of mass movements and sort of what's happening beneath the surface. And I also think what gets left out of what's happened in the U.S. in the 1920s and early 30s is how much of an influence there was of global things that were happening. We tend to, at least I know in my trade, we tend in the U.S. to treat U.S. labor history as the be-all and the end-all. And the more radical things that happened in America in the late 20s and early 30s were factory occupations and things like that actually came from Europe and didn't necessarily come originally out of things that we were thinking about. So I definitely think the country was moving to the left, and I completely agree with your point that the state, Roosevelt, whatever we want to call it, essentially realized they better freaking do something or the potential was there for the left to outrun them. But at the same time, here's a similarity. At the same time, I feel like there was also the rise in the late 20s, early 30s of the right in America as well. And there was an equally, as much as there was this progressive movement and there was the sort of things that we're talking about this morning, there was a vast right-wing conspiracy, for lack of a better term to call it. I mean, there were a lot of people that were really enchanted with Hitler and Mussolini and Franco in Spain, and were really advocating we need a strongman government in America to get the trains to run on time again, put people back to work, and do all this stuff. And so these things are, there's this, for me, that's some of the similarity. We're sort of fighting about the big idea at this point, and I feel like, for me at least, I watched the so-called State of the Union the other night, and I was even more depressed because I feel like there's like nothing there, and it's pretty frightening. So it really will be nurses. My brother's a nurse, and so a surgical emergency room nurse, and so I've had all these kind of conversations with him too. And so I think the future really is to try to figure out how we can build back better a labor movement as opposed to, and one more thing I think that's leading the way, and then I'll stop, is I feel like what's happening on airplanes is also indicative of solidarity. The amount of solidarity with people who are in the planes trying to make us safe, and the fact that people are willing to engage in mid-air armed struggle with crazy-ass people on planes is pretty indicative of, again, that kind of solidarity with persons performing that kind of a vital service too. So there is hope. I mean, I wish that Sarah Nelson was now the head of the AFL-CIO. We'd be in better shape. And for those of you that don't know, she's the person who's the head of the people that work on airplanes. And she's probably one of the most progressive labor people in the country. And the AFL-CIO just picked a new boss. And sort of for me, it's kind of like new boss, same as the old boss. So here we are. Anyway, I'm not esteemed, by the way. Esteemed is code word for old.
I also just can't resist the moment to point out for labor studies students, this is exactly what we were talking about in class on Tuesday, right? When we did the close reading of the preamble of the NLRA. Like, this is a compromise, and both sides are giving something up, and both sides are getting it, but it is cutting off this radical flank, and that's exactly what Dr. McCallum was talking about. I couldn't resist.
Yep. Anything else? Okay, great.
Thank you so much for being here on behalf of all of us. Can we give Dr. McCallum another hand? Also, for my students, make sure you sign in over there.